If you were here last time, you will remember, excuse me, you'll remember that we left off right toward the tail end of the second history session, in part because we wanted to make sure we took the time to talk with you guys about your local history. So thanks for everyone who contributed to that discussion. Um, and so I will hopefully hit the right slide deck, and we'll jump into where we left off last time. That is not the one, although I clicked the right one. So we'll try that again. Same thing happened again. Let me make sure that this works. All right, I think everybody can see the right thing now. I think this is where we left off, and I won't take too much time with this because we have a lot to get into around centering community, which is extremely important in terms of how we approach this work, and how we actually get to that structural well-being that that we know is going to be imperative for how to move any such work forward. So the point of this, right, is really that systems of social control and just sort of human services systems generally over the course of this time, influenced by things that we've already mentioned, such as convict leasing and eugenics, and the various issues that impacted Asian American and Native American communities and Latinx people throughout history, was taking shape over the 1920 through 1978 period, right? So you have child protection societies. If you recall, when we talked last time, there was a humane society for animals, right, before there was anything for children. But by 1922, you have 300 non-governmental child protection societies across the U.S., right? So this is sort of coming into shape. Youth courts are established in 48 states by 1925. The JJDPA comes much later in the process, right? That's the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, and you have the Indian Child Welfare Act, right? So again, this is in response to that sort of shift away from boarding schools for Native American youth to adoption, right? To finding Native American homes, substandard, based on very European or Eurocentric viewpoints of what a household should look like, and using that to remove children from home and thus to essentially force them to assimilate into white society, right? And so ICWA was created, or the Indian Child Welfare Act was created to ensure that that tribes and nations are consulted and are able to, if that child is a member, to claim a child in the event that there is a removal or an issue, a legal issue of custody, and to make decisions about where that child will go and what happens next. The other thing that I wanted to point out here, the first bullet, is mothers' pensions start in 1920, providing state funds for widowed mothers, right? So this happened in the 1920s, and clearly this became a program that the government saw fit to do for mothers who were who specifically who were widowed and had children to raise, so that they had at least some level of funding provided to them for the benefit of their excuse me, families and their children. However, right, even though we saw fit to do that, right, we also saw fit, or the government at that point also saw fit, to exclude Black widowed mothers, Latinx widowed mothers, and Native American widowed mothers. So, right, the reason we're pointing that out is because, even systems that are meant, or programs or policies that are meant for the edification or the benefit of society, and had, on some level, good intentions, were still very exclusionary in terms of who they provided for and who they responded directly to. And so the impact of that was felt generationally and is part of, or is linked to the inequities that we see across systems today. Okay, so really quickly, the Central Park jogger case, and I shouldn't even say really quickly because I gotta kind of tell the story. I think probably many of you will remember the Central Park jogger case, and if you don't remember it, you probably have seen, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend that you watch When They See Us. When They See Us is, I think, a limited series and not a film. I think it's a limited series on Netflix, or a dramatization of, or a depiction of the Central Park jogger case and how it unfolded, particularly how it unfolded for 5 Black and brown boys called the Central Park Five, now known as the Exonerated Five. Long story short, they were exonerated for, but that means, of course, that they were first charged and convicted with a brutal attack, sexual assaults, and battery of a woman who was jogging in Central Park. And they essentially were charged because they were young and naive. They fit the description or the expectation of what someone who would have attacked this woman in this way would have looked like. And they were subject to all sorts of maltreatment and malpractice on the behalf of police officers and attorneys who managed the case and who questioned them. Their parents, for a lot of them, their parents were nowhere to be found. They were not allowed access to their parents as they were questioned. If you watched When They See Us, you know that many of them were abused in some way, whether that was, being physically harmed, right, to force a confession. And so they essentially all confessed to a crime that they did not commit. And, ultimately what ended up happening was that the person who actually did this later came forward, and DNA evidence corroborated that this person had been, the culprit all along. And these 5 boys some of them had already been, released. One was definitely still incarcerated in an adult facility, right? Had become an adult over the course of the case, and was released from that adult facility after being exonerated for this offense. And the reason this case is important is because it's happening in a very visible way, right? That coincides with a lot of mass hysteria and stereotypes around Black and brown boys, and in particular teenagers, and led to, along with some scholarly malpractice that we're going to talk about in just a second, a great uptick in policymaking, particularly legislation, all over the country in various states that created much harsher punishments for youth in custody, or for youth who were charged with offenses, right? And the reason that was happening is because you had a Princeton professor, John DiLulio, who came up with this super predator theory, right? The super predator theory essentially put it that the main threat to the safety of American families at that time was young, essentially Black and brown teenage boys, particularly boys who were raised without fathers, and that something had to be done because these men were without, or these boys, I should say, were without morals. They could not be reasoned with. They were called, not just fatherless, but godless, and in some cases, soulless, right? And because you had this, this very reputable, at the time, professor from a very reputable institution saying these things around the same time that, these boys who were charged and convicted with doing something that they did not do were all over television. They became the poster children for that super predator theory. And because people believed that they did it, and that was ultimately, for many years, the decision of the court, right, was to find them guilty. They were the poster children for this in a way, in a very nationally public way, that again reverberated in all of those legislative changes by lawmakers who believed this theory and said, we have to protect our public, we have to protect our communities from this rising or this mounting threat of the youth or juvenile super predator, right? DeLulio would go on to denounce this theory, many years later, to say that, it was not scientifically sound, that it was irresponsible and inaccurate for him to present it in that way. But of course, by then, those laws had already been created, right? That sentencing structure had already been made in a lot of jurisdictions. And certainly for these five, they had already been through some of the worst experiences you can imagine, especially for teenagers at the time, right? And so I talked a little bit earlier, that is in an earlier session, about how who was coming into youth incarceration or youth serving systems switched from, about 70% white to about 75–80% Black over the course of about, 30 years or so. This was, a very central part of that shift, right? Is the legislative changes that came alongside this sort of mass panic based on a very high profile, high visibility case, right? That a lot of people, and in fact, even the local justice system involved, had wrong at the time, and a scholarly theory about the biggest threat to the safety of the public at that time. And that brings us up to today, right? Accountability for justice. What does that look like, right? You see an image there of George Floyd in his final moments, an image that I think is burned in the brains of all of us at this point and will be for a very long time. And there are a number of other images that we have there, but for the sake of time, we'll go through some takeaways and sort of move on. Takeaways include, remembering that, that indigenous people created Turtle Island and that it was taken away from them. That racism is a health crisis. That current harm is connected to the past, and connected to the past sort of structures, systems, policies, procedures that we have created and that we must change in order to make a significant difference. And that race is a social construct, that there are a lot of policies and procedures that go into the development and adjudication of race, and even court cases that sort of ferret out what that means for people and how they exist, at least in the context of this country. In terms of forward thinking and action, important to share knowledge and information, to be intentional, to develop that local history, right? What does this mean for you, where you are, your local jurisdiction? Developing strategies for the dismantling of structural racism, right? Including the replacing of structural racism with structural well-being, leading through values, right? Which is definitely something that is a part for us of the structural well-being approach, is the development of working agreements, including values and norms for how you guys are gonna interact with each other, how you want your work to manifest, or what you want your work to embody in terms of its values, and becoming comfortable with racial conversations. Also, there has to be, this says reparations, right? There has to be some level of systemic atonement, some sort of systemic response, right, to the history that is, that exists, and that creates or shapes the way that the current world looks, in order for us to move toward that place. So I will stop this particular presentation there, and we can get into something that's also really important for forward thinking and action, which is centering community. Second here to get my slides right. Okay, I think you all can see that. And I'm stepping on my slides. Okay, so centering community. If you guys will recall, those of you who attended the first session that we did, we talked about centering community as a part of the structural well-being approach, and took a little time to go through this diagram and talk about who we're talking about when we say community, right? Because that could be any number of people, right? If you have anyone that represents, any part of a community, right? They live there, they work there, then you might say, hey, community's here, community's represented. And that wouldn't be the case, right? When we talk about community, especially in terms of representation on bodies and boards and collaboratives that will do this kind of work, number one, we're definitely talking about having that diversity and equity that is reflected in the population, right? And in the population demographics. So that means, to the extent that that communities of color are represented within your overall population, if at all possible, those folks from those specific communities should be involved in your collaborative setting, right? And that is always going to be something to push for, right? It may take a while yet to get there, but if we're talking about racial equity, and there's a local Asian population that is absolutely not represented at all, right? Then you don't have community fully, and you're not addressing equity, to the extent that you may want to or hope to in the future if you haven't gotten that yet. So we're definitely talking about diversity and equity and inclusion in the representation and in the composition of decision-making bodies. But in addition to that community representation, right? Community, racial and ethnic community representation, right? White, Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, whoever is in your population. We're also talking about these various different groups, right? So we're talking about directly impacted experts, right? That is folks with lived experience, right? Some people say people who are formerly incarcerated, so on and so forth. We frame it this way, right? Because that is very hard earned and very real expertise. And I don't want to step on the points too much, but it deserves to be valued that way. It deserves to be respected and treated that way in terms of how folks with direct systems impact are involved, are invited, are compensated, whatever the case may be, for their participation, right? Community experts, that's folks who live within or work within a specific community, who can speak to the dynamics that they deal with on a daily basis, right? The expertise of community practitioners, again, folks who work in that specific, you know, area, or who have a history of doing work in this particular community, who can speak to what their experience listening and learning from and working with other community leaders and organizations can tell you. There's also cross-sector agencies, stakeholders, funders, advocacy groups, right? So these are organizations that advocate for specific needs within communities. Obviously, community-based organizations that may provide programs, services, and supports, or that may, may be based on organizing community members for specific purposes or to advance specific struggles, right? These folks don't necessarily make criminal legal system agencies comfortable when they show up, realistically, but this is a very uncomfortable conversation that we should be having. This work is not meant to be comfortable, it's meant to be meaningful. And for it to be meaningful, we have to accept and embrace the uncomfortable, right? So when we're talking about centering community, it's important to go beyond community engagement, to share power and decision-making with community, right? Not just to tokenize, not just to say, can you attend this meeting while we decide what happens, right? But to share that power and to share that decision-making with folks who have direct experience and thus have great insight as to what they need. It's important to be transparent, right? Is there information that is shaping a decision or a position that's being taken that community does not have? And if not, if that's the case, then why don't they have it? Why aren't they being made aware of it? What are the issues that you need to address to be completely transparent with whatever information you're using to make your decision? And finally, of course, believing that those closest to the issue have the solution. That means people who have been through your system have the best idea of what changes the system needs to make in order to change in equitable ways for communities that are overrepresented within them, and for better overall results and better outcomes for everyone. So that's what we mean, or that's sort of an overview of who community is and sort of what we are thinking about when we're talking about centering community. And with that little bit of an opening, we can get into that Jamboard activity. So I think Sandra has just entered into the chat a link for you all to use for Jamboard. And once you all click that link, I will stop sharing this particular screen and go over to the Jamboard and try to provide a bit of a brief tutorial. If folks are not familiar with it, I'm sure many of you are, but don't want to take for granted that everybody knows exactly how it works. So we'll talk a little bit about how to use this in a second. But this whole activity is meant to get some feedback from you all about community centering, right? So you just kind of got a sense of what our definition, or what at least part of our definition or part of our considerations, right, for community centering are. But how would you define community centering, right? What's going well in your jurisdiction currently in terms of centering community in your work? Where are the opportunities for growth in centering community in our work? And don't worry, you don't have to memorize these questions. They will be in the Jamboard for you on 3 separate pages so that we can get some reflections. Would love to hear from folks, may call on people, and I'm not gonna know who I'm calling on because I won't know who wrote what. It's just if I see something that looks like it's worth diving into a little bit more, then I may ask if someone can come off mute and talk a little bit about what they typed into the Jamboard and see if that sparks any further conversation. So if that sounds good to folks, if nobody has any questions or thoughts there, then I will stop sharing my screen here, and then I'll open the Jamboard and share that screen so you guys can see your answers coming up live, and we can talk about what those answers are. Sound good? Not seeing any questions. I think we're good to go. So let me stop sharing this. Okay, briefly, tutorial. This is Jamboard. Essentially, it is an online collaboration tool meant to allow a bunch of people to work on documents or nice visual creations together. And the way that you use it, if folks need a tutorial, especially for our purposes, what I'm going to ask folks to do is to use the sticky note tool, right? So you'll take your cursor, and I think you guys should be able to see mine, go over to the left, hit the sticky note, choose a color from the choices that you have, and then you can type things in here, like, hi, my name is Chris, for example. Click save, it goes there. You can move it around, you can resize it. Hopefully nobody will just take up all of the real estate that we have to work with. And that's how that works. You can also use text boxes, but depending on how things look, especially with the other sticky notes, that could get a little weird after a while. So try to use the sticky notes if you can. It just makes it a little bit easier for the background to be able to see it. And then, you can start answering these questions. There are 4 frames of this. So how do you define community centering is one. What are we doing well in centering communities? The next. Where are our opportunities for growth in centering community? And some of you guys are already responding to those. And actually the 4th is just a blank page, which is what I suspected. So 3, right? Because there are 3 main questions. And let me know if anybody has any questions about that, or if anything seems unclear. Take a brief pause for that. Looks like you guys have it, right? I'm seeing things. I'm sure for most of you, it's probably not the first time you've seen it. So I'll just jump into sort of, sharing a little bit of what I'm seeing, especially for the benefit of the video, right? So I will start with this yellow sticky note here. This is nothing about the community without the community, right? Because that's essentially at the heart of what it is that we're talking about. Nothing about without, which means, if I'm doing something to address inequities in a criminal legal system, right, then I can't exclude from that process in meaningful ways people who have been through that system, people who have the scars, be it literally or figuratively, to prove that. What do they know? What do they understand about how the system operates, about what its impacts are, and about what they would like to see done, or what they would have needed, right? As opposed to perhaps the way that things were done. Oh, and Sandra added to the chat, please feel free to post multiple responses for each board if you are moved to do so. It's a good thing to point out. You are not limited to the one. You can, click this ad nauseum. It's not going to stop you, neither will we. I see centering community equals decentering ourselves. Affected communities come up with the solutions. Now, I think that's a really insightful comment, and I'm gonna ask if that brave soul who wrote that really great salient point in the light blue there could talk to us a little bit about what that could mean or what that could look like in Pima County. Testing his theory that I don't know who it is. Like, he doesn't know it's me. no eye contact, can't see me. I could just hide. All right. Well, I'm glad we have a way to get you guys' thoughts out. Um, you know, even if folks don't feel as comfortable with speaking out loud, I will just add, however, that when we're talking about race, so on and so forth, it's important to be able to get into the fray. You know what I mean, and to have those conversations. So just invite you all to take the opportunity to do that when you can. Um, you know, be brave about it. How do I get a sticky note to move? Okay, so if I make a sticky note and I save it, I should be able to click and drag it. That's the way to get it to move around. Usually I'm clicking from the middle. If you click these three dots, then you'll get that menu. So you want to click somewhere else on it and you should be able to move it around. Someone says white folks do their homework and think twice before proposing their ideas, which is an interesting thing to say, is an interesting way to put it. I would say, somebody's having trouble. Okay, so if you're having trouble getting the sticky notes in, I mean, I guess it wouldn't be as anonymous as maybe you might like, but you are welcome to put a response in the chat. We just kind of know who wrote it. I don't know why that would be an issue, but certainly, you know, if the chat is amenable for you to use, we'd love to get your thoughts however we can. Oh, good point. Elizabeth says, make sure you use the link in the chat because I'm sharing my screen, so it could be easy, you know, for folks to look at the screen and think that what you're seeing on the screen you can manipulate, and you will need to jump out of Zoom for a second and go to your browser after clicking the link, and you will see the same thing that I'm looking at right now, and you'll be able to get into it. So that might be the issue, but I would say, you know, on this last one, you know, in terms of people doing their homework, you know, part of that homework is really reaching out to the right folks, again, valuing that expertise. So not just thinking twice before proposing ideas, but collaborating with people with lived experience, people who have direct service experience, you know, people who have been impacted in some way by these systems, and collaborating with them to develop what comes next. And as this person in the pink said, those closest to harm get to determine the priorities for change. I'm going to move on to the next frame here, if that's all right with folks. You guys can continue to work on any of these that you want, but for the sake of time, that was how do you define community centering. This is, I see Sandra just just deleted that fourth page. Thank you. What are we doing well in centering community in our work? So this is really good. Large network to start with, someone says, and then I see collaborative approaches, and that I would love to hear more about. If that person might be willing to unmute, what do those collaborative approaches look like? What does that mean? So far, take a pause to see if that person wants to chime in before reading the rest of these. Moving right along, being more flexible in modifying work approach is identified as something we're doing well. Workers are being hired from the community to increase the credibility with people, identifying who is not at the table and reaching out to them to invite them to the table. These are all very important things, you know, and I think just this is, especially that last one, that's an iterative process, right? Because you can't know what you don't know. So, you know, you may have in your mind, what you think is a sense of who's not at the table, but the more people you bring to that table, um, and the more perspectives you get that are outside of sort of the mainstream, or particularly the criminal legal system stakeholders sort of mainstream view, the more you may get a sense of, oh, we're missing, X, Y, and Z as well, and that's okay. And it may be that there are various different subcommittees or specific areas where it's better for the sake of time to ask people to attend, as opposed to having everyone in the same sort of unwieldy group. But certainly you will find, as you continue to get out there, and the more diverse the space gets, that there are additional folks who are missing, who you'd really love to have involved as well. Where are our opportunities for growth in centering community in our work? Building authentic relationships with local organizations. All right. Well, I don't know who said this, but we can all go home. Like that. That is extremely important. You definitely need to build authentic relationships with local organizations. That's how you're going to develop any sort of credibility you'd have with the folks that you hope to reach with whatever you're doing anyway, right? Incorporating peers in work, getting more communities and demographics to the table. I see gaining trust, acceptance, and active collaboration with American Indian communities. Okay. Explaining issues and information in a way that the general community can understand. Very important. Being able to ditch or modify public health models when community experts disagree with modalities. So this goes back to someone mentioned earlier in a different way, flexibility, right? It's important to be able to be flexible and to be adaptable to the information that you get once you start to share decision-making power, so on and so forth. Sometimes people get invited to the table just to prove, quote unquote, that a certain group has been included rather than because their input is really valued, right? Tokenizing, right? Which is why this is part of the reason, and Sandra, feel free to stop me if I'm stepping on later points, as I think I'm about to do. But this is why we say centering community goes beyond community engagement, right? Because community engagement so often looks like, okay, we've sort of checked the box here. And to center community means, actually inviting folks to hear what they say and to be flexible and able to pivot based on the feedback that we get. Those are the types of things that mean actually valuing the expertise of folks with lived experience. And that's what centering community is all about. So thank you all for participating non-verbally in this particular part of the experience. Certainly, if other things come to mind, if you still have this link open or you still have access to it in the chat, you can feel free to go back to it and add more for as long as we have this open. And I don't know, Sandra, if we can collaborate on if you want to, make this shareable for the group, since it's mainly related to Pima County, this particular iteration of it anyway. So with that, I'm gonna stop my screen share and turn it over to Sandra, who's gonna really jump into centering community and talk to us a little bit more about what that means.
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, thank you everyone for that participation. Just want to ask any reflections in the chat, like 1-2 word reflections of what you saw or anything that came up for you in thinking about that conversation, defining community centering. What are we doing in our work? What are we not doing well, right? What are the opportunities to actually increase our community centering? So, share that in the chat if you can. I'm going to go ahead and continue the presentation with some more points to make. So, oh, oh, slideshow. Okay, all right. Ooh. So here we have what we call kind of like a continuum. So community engagement, as Chris said, we kind of know what that's like, and I'd love to hear some voices just kind of shout it out. What are some basic and typical community engagement strategies? Let me hear like two examples.
Social media.
Okay. Another way of getting that you engage community?
I put in the chat, you have to surrender ground and you have to share power. You have to be able to garner and give individuals the power that they need to be able to be part of this and hear their voice and make change and bring stuff to the table.
Well, that's more moving towards actually like that's like that power sharing accountability. That's actually moving out of community engagement. And I'm glad that you're thinking about that as being like a starting point. But community engagement is kind of like that first line thrown out, and we're gonna have an event. We're gonna have, let's just get people to come to the meeting at the bare minimum. Let's just have something to show that we have, we're engaged, we're involved, not maybe, bare minimum involved. We have events for youth, we have events for families, we have maybe like your annual block party or community dinner. Community engagement it's a good way to begin to like put ourselves out there and all that. We've seen that, right? When we start to move on this continuum towards a place of community centering, a practice of community centering, we start to shift out of just having people come and show up, sign in your name, and we start to see, okay, we start to go towards not just input, but actually, vote, right? So power sharing and accountability, like you were speaking to, Doyle, is about like is really moving towards community centered. So how do you share your power? Community engagement for putting together an event could be just inviting them to the party. But power sharing and accountability is from the beginning, hey, we want to organize something, we don't know what. Let's invite the community to be a part of making that decision. So I'm talking about something really general, but obviously at the level of work that we do, power sharing and accountability can become more of a threat in the sense of, well, we don't want the community to know everything. We don't want them to have that much decision making. We don't want to really let them choose how much money goes where. But that's what we're talking about. That's the kind of centering that we're talking about, because the community would know where is there not enough money, where is there not enough resource being invested in to really hold accountability for, okay, well, we said we were going to do this, but we didn't. So that accountability is being really held to the word and to your action, not just your word, but to the action. And when more people know about what that action is supposed to be, you're kind of in service of that. We see that as, if people know that we all agree to this, then we hold ourselves to that and to fulfill it, which creates the culture shift, right? And we have a couple slides to just support these points a little bit more, but supports a culture shift of practice, of thinking, of setting up, what the space feels like. How do you invite somebody to a meeting and make them feel like they're being, make them really know that their voice is centered. So all of that, stepping out of our comfort, our discomfort and comfort, and really moving into the being in service of the community that we are responsible for, that we have an accountability to, that we have, we're here to make sure that they have what they need. So that's what we're talking about when community centering from
Sandra, can I ask you a
policy.
question?
Sure.
So I'll give an example, and you tell me if I'm kind of in left field or if we're kind of on the right track. So let's say we identify through data specific area codes or zip codes that are having issues with justice involvement. We coordinate with those neighborhood associations, come to those associations to say, hey, look, the data says we have more justice involvement in this area, but we don't know what the situation is. So we'd like to sit down and put a survey together, a listening session for you guys to tell us what the problems are and why you think this zip code is having more interaction with justice involvement than other zip codes. And as we sit down with you and identify these things, we're going to figure out, based on what you tell us, what we should focus on and how we can support you, whether that be financially, whether that be organizationally, whether that be action-wise, to support you in making a shift in this and what you think should be the priority of the shift. Is that something along what you're talking about?
Are you sharing any power in that involvement? Are you sharing any decision-making power?
By giving, yes, telling them what we need to address. You guys decide in the community what we need to, we see something here, but we don't know what it is. So you tell us what it is, and you tell us what needs to be addressed and how we can help you based on what you tell us.
Okay, we could probably do that in a survey, right? Tell us in the survey what you think needs to be addressed and some ideas. But am I really sharing power to make a decision? Are they at the table to help develop those things that they're recommending and saying, this is what we think it needs to look like? These are the areas that it needs to be in. These are the people that we think need to be employed to get it done. Do they have a say in that?
They would be the ones developing it. We would just be simply there helping facilitate it.
Well, what you described didn't sound like it was something they would be developing. It was more like they were giving input, which would not be centering community, but it would be a way of community engagement.
Roger that.
The power sharing is actually, they're at the table from the onset of the idea, even in developing what the survey would be, even in developing who do we contact, what communities should we go into. It's starting from scratch is where we involve the community to begin to share that power.
Understandable.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a really good question, because that's we really do wrestle with that in the work that we do, right? The positions, justice system, policy making. We've been socialized to think a certain way and think that, well, only we have really the knowledge and understanding, but the people that are being impacted the most, they know what it feels like. They know what the policies and the programs and the decisions that we've been responsible for, they're the ones that feel the brunt of it. They're the ones that experience it. So they would know, yeah, you know what, that actually is not working. That's not a really good plan. But we have some ideas about how that can be changed. So, and it's in partnership. So it's not saying that we won't know, but we probably don't have the whole picture because we don't have them at the table. So that's a little bit of the continuum. So some themes in defining community centering. We're thinking about, and some of you already did a great job in putting it in the Jamboard, centering the needs of those with lived experience. Again, if we were to have those people that, being in Chicago, like I live in the community where the Cook County Jail is housed. It is the eyesore of the neighborhood. It's like in the backyard. And so, but none of us have there's never been a time where I remember as a child, as a young person, as a young adult, that any conversation has ever been had with the community regarding what happens, how are those people supported, that end up going through that system, that are sitting at Cook County, that are experiencing the horrors that are happening in that facility. So centering those needs of the families, of the people directly impacted, building relationships, making sure that it's not just inviting them to the one thing, the one-off survey, the one-off event, but actually maintaining a relationship. And somebody put that in the Jamboard as well, is really key, because when you don't develop those relationships, that's where people stay. People are very cautious and don't want to get involved themselves, because they're like, oh, you're just going to come in and take our ideas and run with it. One very clear experience for me has been, Chris and I work with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians in Mississippi, and one of the elders told us once, he's like, we've just been watching you guys coming for years, not me and Chris, but other people from our organization, and we're just waiting to see if you're actually going to stick around. And so part of our approach is to build authentic relationships, sitting with people, eating with them, going to their community events, being part of community conversations. That's part of building that authentic relationship, as we really want to know, how are you living? How are you experiencing these things? And we want to have a better understanding, right, of who you are and what you need. So that helps us to work towards shifting power, intergenerational representation. So really sitting with not just the youth or not just the adults that are similarly to our age, but actually incorporating all those different tiers of generations that have been experiencing all this work that we've been doing in different ways. The policies, the programs, all of that. In order to really center community, there needs to be a representation of those generations that have been experiencing all of those decision-making points at some point or another. And then community-led and driven. So Doyle, you said we would be facilitating that process, but they would be at the table making decisions. But are they the ones leading too? Are they co-leading? Are they part of, the facilitators? Are they helping facilitate? So those are things to ask ourselves. How is it community-led? Is it community-driven? Are we developing the talking points, or are they the ones saying, this is what we think we need to talk about? And we're at the table with them versus we bring them to the table, but we're actually sitting with them. And if they have something that they want to drive, we're sitting in the car with them and letting them drive, right? Because that also creates a space of belonging. It makes sure that they're not showing up to a meeting because they're not just showing up to a meeting because they got invited, but they're showing up to the meeting because they belong to this collaborative. They belong to these, they have a commitment to their neighborhood, to their region, to their county. They belong. And so it creates that space of belonging, and they're working with you or working alongside us, right, to make it happen. Creates belonging. So community is dynamic, not homogenous. We can't just see, well, one group of people that shows up to the community. I see it all the time. We met with community that one time with that one group of people that is always the one that shows up to the thing. So no, there's so many layers, so many subcultures within a community that we have to identify and acknowledge makes it dynamic. And so we have to do our work and our homework and our pre-work and our post-work in order to really understand what are all the aspects of this community. And I'm not looking at the chat, but I could see there's a lot going on. Is there anything that, I see lots of great questions. We'll come back to that, definitely. Got my piece is not that long. So elements of community centering, and maybe this, hopefully maybe this answers some of those questions I saw in the chat. We talked about power sharing. So again, it's not enough to just invite people and have them give their input and give ideas, but actually power sharing, giving them, okay, so you all will have a vote and a voice and a choice and all that happens. You will have all the information, the entire budget. You will know every dollar, every penny that is to be spent, and you will have a say in where that goes. Versus there's $10,000 we're going to separate for community events. You can work on that, but you can't work on the services and all of the other things, all the other areas that this budget normally goes to. You're only going to work on the fun stuff. That's not power sharing. It's not valuing the expertise of lived experience. It's not shifting the paradigm of transactional relations with community. And that's normally what happens is community sits back and they see people come in, they want to do something, give us your input, they walk away. We never see from them again. We never hear from them again. We never see them again. That's very transactional. That's very like, give me something, I'll give you, oh, we bought you food. That's great. Thanks for your time. We move on. So we want to shift from that. We really want to say, well, that's not what we're going to be about. We're going to actually build relationship. We're actually going to bake something in together. Acknowledging and navigating differences in and among communities. We just mentioned that as well. It's going beyond just what our assumptions are, our biases, and really saying, okay, what is the full spectrum? What's the full rainbow of this community? What are all the sub communities within this community? What does that look like? How are we adapting our meetings to acknowledge all of those things? How are we adjusting or accommodating what some needs are from some of the community members? Do we have childcare? Do we have accessibility for everyone? Do we have translators? Do we have all of that to, what does our community need in order to be able to participate? Creating safe and brave spaces. What does that mean, right? What does it mean to create a safe and brave space? Well, in the context of how we think about this as the Burns Institute and all of our experiences as people from different communities, this to us really means creating a safe space where a safe, brave, meaning you can actually speak your truth, no matter if no one else in the room agrees with you or thinks that that is even possible. It is your individual truth, and you can say it without judgment, without it being held against you. There may be discussion, there may be disagreement, but you can still say it and be respected and be honored and be allowed to share that. So that's the essence of what we're talking about when we're creating safe and brave space. And that acknowledges everyone's humanity, right? Their dignity, their ability to say, you know what, I don't remember having that experience as a child, but if you had that, wow, I feel it, I'm hearing you, I'm here to hear you. I'm not understanding, but I'm hearing you, right? Just acknowledging that dignity and acknowledging that that person had that experience. Many times when we're working in communities with a whole, panoramic view of experiences, we start to feel uncomfortable with, well, I don't know about that. I've never had that, or that didn't happen to me. It's not about whether or not it happened to you. It's knowing this is happening in this community. And if I'm in service of this community, then I need to know about it. And I should probably learn to understand that more to be able to be in service of, to be able to support, to know what resources need to be brought to help this community or support the community. Recognizing and repairing harm. Many times we don't realize how, system folk, system representation has actually harmed community in thinking that they're not harming. And so we have to acknowledge and recognize at least, okay, people feel uncomfortable. The community does not trust us. We recognize this and we want to work towards rebuilding that. And how we go about that is going to take all of these other elements to be put in place. So that's also a level of accountability, right? That we need to hold ourselves like, maybe you weren't there, particularly as an individual when that happened. But if we're working with that system, if we're working with that organization, that may have been the cause of that, then now we represent that, and we should move to recognizing and repairing whatever that was to be able to rebuild that trust with the community. And we talked about intergeneral representation, trust, and partnership. So all of those things will move. It's not going to happen in one meeting. It's not going to happen in 1 week. It may not happen in a year, but you build and you work towards building that trust and really a partnership, a collaboration where people feel like, I like coming to this meeting. This is where things get done. This is where I have a say. This is where I'm going to make a difference for the issues that I see that are important. Shifting towards those most impacted. We think about, I used to work in I was restorative justice practitioner and coach for schools here in the Chicago Public School District. And I always think about like how the teacher in the room identifies the one child that they say is the most problematic, but not looking at it through a strength-based, where they see, well, if there's something wrong in my teaching, in my approach to teaching, in my approach to educating, this child is probably the best person to tell me why is it not getting their attention? Why are they so disassociated? Why are they so uninterested? Maybe they're excluded? Why not engage them more versus push them away, send them to the, to the dean or the principal? So thinking about it like that, when we involve those that have been the most impacted by harmful policies, those are the folks that are really going to tell us this does not work. And I'll tell you why. Because what I actually needed was this, but what I got instead was that. What I was looking for was this. What doesn't exist in my neighborhood is not this. They're the ones that are going to help, really shift all those other practices that we just mentioned. So having them be part of the power and decision making, bringing their expertise, they're going to be able to tell us what is being said, what is being felt. They're going to be able to identify what are the resources that are actually needed, where is the money not going, and they're going to be able to say, what do we need? How do we really look out for our well-being, and how do we shift our culture to really supporting well-being versus being punitive, versus taking away, versus kind of being the afterthought. So shifting towards those most impacted, not just in how we're looking at things, like what are the solutions, but bringing them to the table, like deliberately bringing them to the table to be a part of that centering community piece, having them at the table to help make those decisions, to lead some of that decision making, to facilitate, is a key instrument to really shifting power. A few things to consider. We say individuals, we have on the left side, we have like, when you're thinking about who, in terms of individuals, who in your community, who do you reach out to, who do you engage, who do you involve? The individuals, we ask that you consider these things. What is, how do they identify in terms of their race or ethnicity? How do they identify in terms of their gender, their sexuality, their age, their ability, their language, their lived experience? Consider all those things. Do we have a mixture of those folks at the table? Do we only have a strong race of ethnic background? Do we have, and then what is that? Is it mixed? Is it only in one particular race or ethnicity? Gender? Are we mostly male? Are we mostly female? Are we not enough of, are we not a mixture of gender non-conforming, gay, but LGBTQ. Do we have more folks from those? Do we have just young people? Do we have not just older people? Do we not have young people? How young do we want to go? Do we want to have subgroups of young people? Is that a population that we see needs to be addressed? Ability, are we only thinking about people that walk on two legs? Are we thinking about the people that have multiple areas of ability? Are we thinking about language? Are we using translators? Do we translate our materials that we post, that we hand out? Are our websites, all of those things? We're thinking about organizations. So considering what types of organizations. Are we just thinking about the organizations that get the big bucks? Or are we thinking about the smaller organizations that are really doing some of this work? Are we only working with certain churches? What kind of leadership? What size of staff do they use? Neighborhoods and communities, region, geography. What is their relationship with the system, relationship with other communities? So the cultural history of Black, Indigenous, people of color. On a large scale, these are things to really consider in terms of communities, how we're going to define our community centering, and how are we going to center our community in this way, based on these things. And a few more things, just these are the questions I would say, and when you get the slide deck, please go back to these, and hopefully these will help to really formulate your own pathway to centering community, thinking about these particular questions, right? Who is community? Who are we centering? How does it look, smell, sound, and feel, and touch? Which really means, what is the experience of that person when they come to the table? Do they feel excluded? Do they feel included? How can we make that happen, right? What are the cultural practices of who is being centered? Do we allow for other people with different cultural practices to open the meeting? Do we really cater food that appeals to different cultures in the room? Do we allow for cultural performances or cultural spaces to occur? How is this reflected in our system collaborative and community space meetings and gatherings? And I think that last part, how might having an intersectional lens be important to centering community? I think that's like the culmination of all of this. Like, how is that really going to put us over the top in a good way to say we're not just thinking about, when we think community, we think about this small view that maybe we've been working off of, but now we have an intersectional lens that we can really expand on, to really expand our outreach, expand our message, expand our work, expand our reach. And finally, shifting, like the cultural shift. This is an example of W. Haywood Burns. So we do have what we call our community organizing arm. This is the Community Justice Network for Youth, CJNY. And actually the gathering on the left is CJNY, which works with the National Youth Alliance for Men and Boys of Color. So this was like a strategic planning meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico at La Placita Institute. And this was a mixture of folks that were coming together, youth-led, youth-driven, and making decisions on the strategy for this particular organization. These were people from all across the country that met here to develop their strategic plan. And then you have on the right side some folks from our Midwest cohort, Midwest network, that were the cohort that was planning the Midwest Regional back in 2017. So what we try to do is practice exactly what we share with others, to practice and paying local directly impacted youth and community consultants, collaborative fundraising and partnerships with community, fiscal sponsorship of our network leaders, and member-led strategic planning. Right now, we're currently engaging in a member-led strategic planning for the network, which is not made up of like these three staff right here, but actually a team of consultants that represent the different over 200 organizations in a smaller scale, and then including folks in all the different other ways to be part of the strategic plan. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, really quickly, because I want to make sure that we have time to answer questions. Sandra, you mentioned that there was a question that you wanted to respond to. I probably responded to it to some degree in the chat, but I wanted to give you time to really get into that. So really quickly, this is just here to remind you that centering community is a part of, right, the well-being approach. It's one component of what we're trying to do. So as we're establishing a cross systems collaborative and developing that awareness of structural racism and developing these working agreements and using cross-sector data and information to lead up to cross-sector transformational change, right? One of the most important components of what we do is centering community in all of this cross-sector, interwoven, cross systems sort of involvement and engagement and partnership. That community is the missing link that's going to make whatever comes out of this go, and what's going to make it work. And I think a lot of the times the reasons why so many things that have been tried don't work is because you're missing that very crucial component, which is having the people who've been directly impacted speak to what they need. So this is obviously we could have highlighted a bunch of different parts of this, and we did highlight more than one, but certainly wanted to leave you with what it means to center community. And I will stop talking right there. So Sandra, if you wanted to respond to any of the questions that you saw in the chat, or if folks have any additional questions in the remaining 9 minutes that we have left, definitely want to hear those.
I'm scrolling up to see. I know there was something that came up. Using how can we recruit community members to help develop the survey to learn what the community needs? Well, I mean, after hearing what we just heard, I mean, what do folks think that you can do other than just inviting them to a one session? How would you go about recruiting community members to help develop a survey, and what else would they do as part of that? Any thoughts, ideas? I mean, I'm not sure what is your relationship with community. So I had posted in the Jamboard, one of the first post-its that you saw in there was like, you start with the large network. So you kick off with who's your immediate network, bring them to the table, and they invite people, ask them to invite people. Who do they think needs to be there? That would be a suggestion that I would make, and it's a suggestion based on a practice that I know I've engaged in. It's always you start with the small, and then they say, you know what, I think this person needs to be there. And obviously, you don't want to blow up right away. But you do want to start off with the community deciding who should be a part of this. What would this survey process distribution look like? What's the purpose of the survey? What do we want to gain out of this survey? Like, they would be the ones to determine. So you can reach out to who's in your network already of community-based organizations, or like, and they might identify community leaders, individuals that are not tied to organizations, mentors, coaches, people or young people that are like, you know what, this person's doing really good work. Let's see if they want to come, you know, to be a part of this. So that would be one suggestion, Sarah.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I said this in the chat, um, but I'll say it a little bit differently. If you wanted help with something like the development of a survey, say in a more traditional or professional setting, probably one of the things that you can think about doing in terms of recruitment is figuring out how you could compensate
Yes.
someone to do that, right? If you're hiring somebody on, or if you're stipending someone, or whatever the case may be, hey, we need some help, and we're looking for, you know, a good expert in this arena, and we have this to offer you to do that. And so essentially, I'm saying, you know, that dynamic shouldn't change for you because you're talking about community, or because you're talking about specifically talking about folks who may have lived experience, or who may, you know, be representative or reflective of the population that you're trying to reach, because all it means is in a different, you know, sort of way, but really to the same degree, you have, you know, an expert, right, that you're looking to involve. And
Mm-hmm.
so in valuing the expertise of people who are directly impacted, like part of how you do that is to pay them like the experts that they are. Not always, you know, not always, you know, workable, or at least like not always in the short term. But I mean, I think it's important as you start talking about centering community and centering their voice and so on and so forth, that you're not asking them for something for nothing. Um, you know, when we think about these meetings and, you know, all of the sort of stuff that we do, for a lot of folks, maybe not everybody on this call, but for a lot of us on this call, this is something that, you know, we get to bill somebody ultimately, right, for the time that we're spending in this space to think about or to work on these things. And so for community, oftentimes that's not the case. And I think it gets a lot more difficult to have community, and especially to have them in force, you know, or in, you know, large number. If it's like you're a volunteer, we're all gonna, you know, receive some level of compensation for the hour or two that we're spending here, but you come for free because it's the right thing to do, or because you care enough about the issue to want to be involved that much. And that's good enough for us if it's good enough for you. That definitely can change the dynamic for a lot of people.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Um, yeah, compensating community experts, not necessarily the formal consultant types, but actually the 18-year-old, the people that we're bringing on, those are the ones that we would compensate. So that needs to be a real strategic move, to budget for as a department, as a program. Um, and then remembering that even if you're talking, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation around surveys, that is still only an engagement level, base level type of activity, not really a community centering level. So moving past, if that's where you begin, that's where you begin. But to move towards community centering is, really stepping way out of, if you want to start by integrating those practices in a survey process, but really moving towards building off of that. So it shouldn't just end at the survey, but actually, what is the survey for? What is it going to do? What is it going to inform? And what is it going to help build? I don't know, Sharon. That's going to require conversations with your, people that make decisions on in your departments. That's a practice. That's a culture shift and a practice, a shift in practice. So that is something that we as the organizations or the departments have to make the intentional and deliberate shift towards. But good
Yep.
question.
It is a good question. Too good to answer succinctly, for sure. All right, like there would be a whole series of iterative conversations and thoughts and practices and processes over time that would just continue to develop and build on themselves. For how to do that, I think, you know, one of the things you might think about is, is there a way to pilot what you're thinking about, right? Is there a way to get some level of information, not in a transactional way, but to get some meaningful information from community members who are willing or able to be a part of the process in some way because they're compensated, because they want to know more, because whatever the case may be. And what does that insight do for you, right, on some small scale? Because if you can demonstrate the value, I think that might be a big part of proposing that restructure, is look how much more value we got, or look how much more successful or effective this foray was, because we were able to get the level of information that we got. And so we need to move in that direction in a major way, which is going to take restructuring, which is going to take budgets and other considerations looking a little bit different, but it's going to be worth it in the end. And we have a small example of how worth it can be right here. All right, I think we are at time. It is 6:30 here in Florida. And so certainly don't want to cut anyone off if somebody was thinking of a question, but I really appreciate everyone's attendance over the course of the series, seeing a lot of familiar, at least names and pictures. So that's good. Thank you all. And again, like I said, I will be putting PDFs out in link form and sending those to Doyle to send out to the email group or whoever this has all been presented to. So looking forward to you all being able to take that information and, to run with it however you can.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you guys for what you have done and for these series that you have put together for us. If whoever's still left on this call, I would encourage you to do your little clap your hands emoji over your picture to give these guys a hand for what they've done and how they've supported us through this process. This was great. We so appreciate you guys and for what you've done. We are excited to continue, like Chris said, to get these slides, to utilize these slides in our community collaborative with our racial equity cohort and some of the community action team work we're trying to develop as we start engaging with these communities to do this racial equity and disproportionality work. So for those of you who are not part of our cohort or part of our REC and want to be part of the action teams, I did put in the chat, but I did put com instead of gov, but Sarah corrected me. So please, Justice Services at pima.gov, reach out to us so you can continue to participate with us as we continue to work with the Burns Institute and other strategic advisors on the projects that we have before us and the grant deliverables that we're working on. But if there's no other questions or concerns, I just want to say thank you, and we appreciate you guys, and we look forward to working with you guys to making a difference in Pima County. And thank you again, Burns Institute, for your professionalism, your expertise, and your knowledge. And we're excited to continue to work with you guys on this path, this journey. Anybody have anything else one more time before we sign off? Nope. All right, please don't hesitate to do the survey real quick, 5 quick questions. And with that, we will see you guys at our next learning series or working with us in our collaboratives to get these things off the ground and running. Thank you guys, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all, and thank you, Dad Joke Doyle.